What the heck is tone mapping? How does it work? How's it even relevant to games? What's HGiG? What are all these different standards? Dolby Vision? Is that even related? Let's take a look at tone mapping in Windows 11 because it actually does tone mapping, unlike Windows 10. And there's a tool that we can download that shows you how to actually tone map Windows, something you didn't know existed. When I said HDR is this big giant like triangle and there's like a little triangle in here for SDR, that's a complete lie. And the reason it's a lie is because there are multiple triangles. And even SDR, there's like one that looks kind of like this. There's SDR, Adobe RGB. SDR is referred to as Rec 709. There's also 601 that I've seen. I don't even know where that came from, but it's a thing. There's this like DCI-P3, which is like what my monitor can represent in a color space. And then you have this Rec 2020, which is like, wow, Blu-ray stuff. That's good stuff. Most screens can't do it at all. They cannot represent more than DCI-P3 colors. So color space is another thing that matters, and we haven't gone into that, but it is very important. Color space affects how many colors are available. So when you talk about HDR, what you're really talking about is DCI-P3 or Rec 2020 color space. Typically Rec 2020, but if you're running a game and it's Rec 2020, it's not gonna look as good as DCI-P3 because your display probably can't display those colors. Even my OLED can't represent those colors as well in the Rec 2020 space. It's just so hard for today's current displays to represent that many colors. So again, 10-bit colors and notches. HDR is a standard that allows you to get brighter screens. Wide color gamut is part of this HDR marketing, but that's the DCI-P3 or Rec 2020 color spaces. And even in the SDR, 709 is SDR, and you could say Adobe RGB is SDR, but Adobe RGB is really meant for photo editing for what's going to be printed out. So it's a little bit different as well. And that color space is a lot more red available to it. And if your display can display that red, then it could do Adobe RGB. My display can do, anything inside of DCI-P3. Anything outside of DCI-P3, it's going to look worse. It's just not going to be able to represent those colors properly. So there's a game called Sinuous Sacrifice or something like that. Basically, it has a setting in it for DCI-P3 and Rec 2020, and you can change between them when you're in HDR mode, which I think is really cool that you can change between them because DCI-P3 was a lot more colorful on my display than Rec 2020, although Rec 2020 looked more accurate, looked more like SDR, whereas DCI-P3 just looked way too colorful. And maybe that's correct, but I was picking it because my display can't even do anything outside of that range. So I was like, this is correct. But I think their engine didn't display it correctly. It just seemed wrong to me. Maybe it is correct because it was more desaturated on the 2020, which is obvious because my display can't represent those colors. So it would be more desaturated. So I'm not sure. So HDR is really, I say high dynamic range, and it's how bright your colors are really going to get. That's about it. And then there's these color spaces, and then there's 10-bit color, which is also completely different. So hopefully, I've explained to you how all of these are related, how the HDR standards is PQ and HLG work, how HLG is more like SDR and kind of pre-tone map, how HDR10 requires tone mapping on a display, or you could just use that nice roll off. But again, it's still tone mapping. It's just a nice roll off of the peak brightness. And then how Dolby Vision is a tone mapper, and it is built into the content itself, so your TV doesn't have to guess. And I say TV there because your monitor is not going to be doing any tone mapping unless it's Windows 11. Then you can do tone mapping, and I showed you how to calibrate your display with the Microsoft Windows HD calibration app that I got from the Windows Store during this thing that I was doing here. Starting is in the goal. This is really clear, and it calibrates your display to the HGiG standard, which is not an actual standard. It's a set of guidelines. HGiG is a set of guidelines for the HDR gaming interest group, which is a set of companies that have gotten together and wanted to make HDR look better for consumers because it looked horrible for gaming when you have to depend on the TV, and the game engine wasn't in charge of that. This whole Dolby Vision thing doesn't make sense to me because Dolby Vision is tone mapping, but if your game engine supports tone mapping itself, if you basically say, here's what my display can do, then the game engine can tone map for you, and then you don't need Dolby Vision. It doesn't make any sense for games. I don't know why it's a feature in the Xbox, why it can make things look better or worse. It doesn't make any sense because the game engine can just handle how it wants to do that tone mapping instead of having the TV do it. I'm not exactly sure what the difference is there. Yeah, here's the three-dimensional thing I was trying to show you before. It was 3D. The triangle that I displayed at first, the reason it didn't make any sense is because the bottom is black and the top is color, and that's what I was trying to represent, but I realized once I did it that I shouldn't have made it 2D. It didn't make any sense. BT 2100 PQ, this is the PQ thing I was talking about, and 2100 is the standard. I know I said Rec 2020, BT 2100, these are all the same kind of things, but this is a slightly different standard. I don't want to go into it because I don't understand it enough. So they're talking here that if some players can see the right turn after the tunnel, other players can't. This is all in HGiG. They're saying that because the TV is not tone mapping correctly or something like that, then basically it's not displaying the correct information and you can't actually see there. Now, I think you would normally be able to see there because of exposure levels in general, which happens in Forza Horizon 5 when I played that and come out of the tunnel. It's like, wow, it's freaking bright, and then it auto exposures back to in a place I can see. So I don't really understand this particular piece here, but they're basically saying that details in bright areas are critical to gameplay play and may be lost because your TV's tone mapping. So it's going to try to make this part as bright as it can be because it wants to tone map it or something like that. And what you want is the game to be tone mapping and not the display. So they're talking here about its best practices and recommendations. That is what HGiG is. It's just best practices and recommendations. I know all consoles have this, but not every game uses the HGiG settings in the console. It's not really HGiG settings because HGiG is really just the HDR gaming interest group. It's a group. It is not a standard. They just have this document from Microsoft and Sony for how you should set up HDR in your games and how displays should not have tone mapping built in so that the game can handle it for you, or the console can handle it, or Windows can handle it. And this is one of the best standards I've seen. But you don't want this for your normal streaming information for when you're watching a movie or something, because then you're basically losing out on data that you would normally have, since that is not meant for no tone mapping. Or like I said, it would have the roll off, but it can't 100% turn off the tone mapper, or else anything that's past your display's peak brightness would get cut. Now, I guess there's some other thing I want to say real quick before we finish up here, and it's that if we had 10,000 nit displays, you don't need Dolby Vision. Dolby Vision, like I said, is a tone map. You don't need any tone mapping. If your displays could do 10,000 nits, you absolutely need no tone mapping. Tone mapping is there because the content is brighter than your display's capabilities. If your display is 4,000 nits of peak brightness at 100% of the window, and you're watching a movie at 1,000 nits, you need no tone mapping. So you should turn off the tone map. It doesn't make sense to have it on because it's going to try to map 1,000 nits into 4,000 nits, which is not the creator's intent, and it's probably going to look really bad. Now, games upscale look good because the internal engine of the game has 16-bit per channel color values. That color exists in the engine. You just have to get access to it. That's why something like Special K can work, and it can convert a game to HDR, even though the game engine doesn't have HDR as a setting. Special K can make it HDR because it can get access to the internal parts of the game and get access to the 16-bit color values and shrink them down to 10-bit color values, and also fix the brightness problem because the games are all clamping these brightness values. Now, in DirectX 12 mode and with Windows Auto HDR, you're basically faking it. You're upscaling SDR to HDR, and it's not going to look as good, and it might even mess up some of the colors, and it's doing this upscale here. But with games, it's a little bit better than doing it with movies because you have more information available to you, like depth buffers and stuff like that. Auto HDR doesn't do that. It just takes SDR output and then upscales it to HDR. It still looks really good. It's just not as good as native or HDR in the game with a Special K. That's what I want to talk about. These cool things. I would highly recommend you read this because this is what, 25 pages, and it's not that much text, and it explains exactly how this calibration works, how it works with the games. Oh yeah, max FFTML, all this stuff. It's basically the full frame versus a 10% versus the minimum that your display is capable of doing, and then basically figuring out how to make everything look correct in your display at any given size of brightness of the things on the screen for your display's actual capabilities. It's essentially like coding on bare metal. So instead of making HDR and just being like, here it is and it's done, you're saying here's HDR, and I need to have the game engine figure out exactly how to display this data at what colors, at what brightness, based on what is currently in the scene for your specific display. You're actually coding HDR dynamically for your display using the game engine, and it's only going to work if the game engine supports this technology. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense. I know a lot of people like to look at the 10% and be like, it's my peak brightness. A lot of game engines, I've seen it where they have native HDR. That's it. They just, you have like a little thing on screen, they're like, here, grade it for that, and there you go. But then when something is like full brightness, you're going to lose a lot of detail. It's going to look dim and not look nice to you. Yeah, it's going to kind of look like this where you don't have any detail in the clouds here because of that. And this is so cool. I've seen this like category 1 and category 4 displays. Again, this is not a standard, it's a set of guidelines, and they're talking about how you can have a display like this, which is probably more like mine right now. Mine would fit into the sphere, but it would not look that bad, and how to make it look better because you're going to have these restrictions and things like that on the display. And so how you can get this, what is the extended range and all that. So I would highly recommend you read this document if you want to find out that information. This is all about how they expect manufacturers to handle this. So hopefully that gives you all the information about HDR and SDR that I know. Hopefully I didn't miss anything. Color spaces, 8-bit, 10-bit color, which is the notches, and then the gamma curves, which is the how the notches are closer together on the darkness side versus the lightness side, and then HDR, which is essentially the brightness that your screen can go. Although, like I showed you, my monitor can do 500 and something nits of peak brightness in SDR, which is possible because of the way SDR handles the color values, whereas PQ is from 0 to your brightness, and that is it. You're not supposed to change that. Basically, that's what it's going to use. Now you know what HGiG is. If you want to learn more, go ahead and subscribe, or catch my previous video on me just mind dumping everything I know about HDR, because it's not just 10-bit color. Also, I mean, like the video, right? Why wouldn't you do that? How could you do that to me?